Hello everyone, this is Dr. Stephen Bilois presenting for the Regent University Roundtable 2022 in the area of biblical perspectives. Here's an overview of the paper I'm submitting for the Roundtable. The title of my paper is Finding Purpose and Meaning in the Workplace Through Spiritual Transcendence. Lessons from the Apostle Paul's Teachings to Early Christian Slaves. By way of introduction, I'll be covering Purpose and Meaning in the Workplace, a Conceptual Model. Spiritual transcendence as a potential pathway to discovering purpose and meaning in the workplace. We'll be looking at slavery in the New Testament context in order to understand Paul's teachings on the subject. And then we'll look at Paul's teachings to early Christian slaves from the epistles to the Ephesians and Colossians. And then finally, a contemporary application and conclusion. First of all, workplace purpose and meaning, a conceptual model. According to Schute, the need to create meaning is inherent for our very existence as human beings, including in the area of work. Steger says that defines meaningful work as any paid or unpaid work or occupational role people fulfill that is judged by them to possess meaning, purpose, or significance. That's his definition of what we call meaningful work. And by that definition, you can see it is a subjective viewpoint based on the viewpoint of the worker himself or herself. The review of the literature indicated 4 antecedents for a person to have meaningful work. Now, all 4 may not be present, and there were some differences, some others, but these 4 were the most common. Not everyone has to be present. At least one would be, according to these definitions, and usually more than one. First of all, organizational values consistent with the worker's values. This is the first antecedent. Second is a sense of community where the worker feels that he or she is connecting with her fellow workers or customers or whoever they happen to come in contact with, creating a sense of community. Next, value and enjoyment from performing the work itself. And then number 4 is a sense of transcendence. Sense of transcendence, sometimes derived from a religious perspective, although not always that's the case. So these 4 antecedents are usually experienced as a way to get to meaningful work in the viewpoint of the worker. Next, we'll look at the definition of what is spiritual transcendence as a potential pathway to discovering purpose and meaning in the workplace. Now, first of all, at defining spiritual transcendence. Spiritual transcendence definition comes from Piedmont, and that is the capacity of individuals to stand outside their immediate sense of time and place, to view life from a larger and more objective perspective. In order that a way to look at life, stand above it, which is what transcendence means, and look at it from a different viewpoint where they see the whole picture, hopefully from a higher spiritual perspective beyond the immediate benefit of the work, say just for the economic benefits. More about that, of course, later. William James, he was a pioneer, early pioneer in the scientific study of religious experience. He asserted that the core of spiritual experience was the concept of a transcendent reality that gives purpose and meaning to life. And so anything that he defined as spiritual, he said, usually at the very center of it was some sort of transcendent reality, often defined as God, but not always. And that's what gives purpose and meaning to life. Spiritual transcendence in the workplace sometimes is described as a sacred duty to God, or viewing God as one's supervisor. That comes from Behesh, Tafar, and Zer. And that idea of God as one's supervisor is very similar to the Apostle Paul's teaching to the early Christian slaves. The idea that whatever work you're doing, regardless of what it is, God cares about it and wants you to do it a certain way, and that is very important. And so God is like a person's supervisor, and that's very important to the idea of spiritual transcendence, and this sometimes came out in much of the literature on the concept of meaning and purpose and spiritual transcendence as a way to obtain that meaning and purpose in one's job. Now, next of all, since Paul's instructions were given to slaves in the early Christian church, we'll need to look at slavery in the New Testament context in order to understand what Paul was saying and who were these people that he was communicating with in his instructions. First of all, it should be noted that slavery was a common legal and social institution in the Roman Empire, as it was in most of the ancient world. It was viewed as a normal part of society and rarely questioned. And that's important for today's and modern minds. We view, of course, the institution of slavery as something terribly immoral, repugnant. But back then, it was hardly questioned. It was just part of society. People grew up with it. So it certainly was a different viewpoint. It was so common that it's documents that indicate that as many as 20% of all people living in the Roman Empire were slaves. And that number was about 30% in and around Rome itself. So you can see it's very common, 1 in 5, perhaps 1 in 3 in some places in the Roman Empire. Although slaves were generally treated humanely, corporal punishment was legal and sometimes administered. So you have to remember that. In general, they were treated humanely, but not always. It would depend on who was their owner and master and how he or she wanted to treat them, and they had great leeway in doing so. Slaves were considered the master's property, could be bought and sold like any other object. So this is something to keep in mind. In some cases, slaves could have a fairly high standard of living with masters who had some wealth, and it's usually those with wealth who owned slaves. They might be treated well, but they could not leave that job. They were property. They had no legal way of leaving other than if they could raise enough money to buy their freedom. But that was difficult to do, as slaves didn't have much money and required a certain amount of money. Although it did happen from time to time where slaves could be freed. In his epistles, Paul is likely addressing household slaves who often served in the master's homes or helped with their master's business affairs. So it was a certain type of slave, and they were very common and seen throughout the Roman Empire. So there's a brief context of what slavery was like in the New Testament, which is the first century Roman Empire. Next, we'll look at what did Paul specifically tell the slaves in his instructions from his epistles to the Ephesians and Colossians. We'll look at 2 passages here and look at the wording and see what Paul specifically instructs and where we can get our lessons from here. First, we'll begin with Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 8. My translations will come from the New Revised Standard Version, the updated edition. And the instructions here are fairly simple and straightforward. Let's read Ephesians 6, 5 through 8. The text states, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and trembling, in singleness of heart, as you obey Christ, not with a slavery performed merely for looks, to please people, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the soul. Render service with enthusiasm, as for the Lord and not for humans, knowing that whatever good we do, we will receive the same again from the Lord, whether we are enslaved or free." That's the first passage. The second passage will be coming from Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through 25. Let me read that text. "Slaves, obey your masters in everything, not with a slavery performed merely for works, to please people, but wholeheartedly fearing the Lord. Whatever task you must do, work as if your soul depends upon it, as for the Lord and not for humans, since you know that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You serve the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back whatever wrong has been done, and there is no partiality." Well, the passages are pretty simple and straightforward. I see 4 main points that we can derive from these passages. Number 1, of course, is very clear and precise. Paul was telling the slaves they must obey their earthly masters in everything they do. Second of all, he tells them how they should be doing it. And he uses phrases and words like in singleness of heart, not merely perform for looks, doing the will of God from the soul, render service with enthusiasm, wholeheartedly. Again, not merely for works in both passages. You notice how both passages are very similar and their instructions almost identical. Do as if your soul depends upon it, says from Colossians. So you can see all that. They're to do it not just an obligation or because they have to, but straight from the heart and all the time, whether someone's looking or not. And then the third point that I see from these passages is that there is a reward promised if they do the work the way that God wants them to. If they do it as instructed, there is a reward from God that's promised there. Whether they get it from their earthly master or not, he said God will promise as a reward. And in the passage in Colossians also talks about kind of emphasizes whatever we pay back, whatever has been done, whether you do right or wrong, perhaps implying that if you do the work and not in the manner that the Lord wants, there could be some sort of punishment as well. So, and then the fourth thing, and perhaps the main point I'm making, is that you notice in these passages that Paul instructs the slaves that they need to consider that they're doing their work and not just for their earthly master, but for Jesus himself, for the Christ himself. And particularly in the little phrase in Colossians, it says you serve the Lord Christ, and you should be doing your work as for the Lord, not just for the earthly master. And so you see this idea that Behesh and Zer came out, that God is your supervisor. Paul is saying that, and that is a way that these slaves can transcend the work that they're doing. From a human standpoint, from an earthly point of view, they're merely slaves doing whatever their master requires. They have no choice. They're legally bound to do the work, and sometimes it may not be pleasant. It's not desirable work. But he says you're really doing it for the Lord, and from that you can derive great value, knowing that it's the God of the universe you're actually serving, and that he will reward you if you work the way you should. And so in this sense, you can see by faith the slave has to look at it from a different viewpoint, rise above the mere earthly work, and view it from a heavenly perspective, if you will, with God as their supervisor. And that way, they can transcend the ordinary work that they're doing, and it can become something of a much higher value, a much higher purpose and meaning. Now let's look at a contemporary application here. Is there a need for this teaching today? And there certainly is. Management surveys indicate that most workers want to add meaning to their work and a connection to something greater than themselves. Surveys done by Helper of more than 4,000 Fortune 500 executives and managers back in 1988 revealed that 58% of them believe that they had wasted their lives in pursuit of meaningless goals. These are executives and managers in big companies. So we can see that people, even some of the most high status workers, feel that their current jobs are not very meaningful at all. Many workers feel trapped in low status, low paying jobs that appear meaningless. Now they may not be legally trapped or they're required as first century slaves were, but some cannot, feel they can't leave due to economic reasons. They're in this jobs, they don't like it, but they have to do it, or at least that's how they view it. But Paul is saying through his teaching, you can transcend this by viewing Jesus Christ as Lord and supervisor of one's work, that it suddenly can take on great meaning and value. And that is the way spiritual transcendence is a potential pathway to meaning and purpose in the workplace. So we conclude, we've looked at purpose and meaning in the workplace, a conceptual model. Spiritual transcendence as a potential pathway to discovering purpose and meaning in the workplace. We looked at the slavery in its New Testament context, then examined Paul's teachings to early Christian slaves from the epistles to Ephesians and Colossians. Finally, we looked at contemporary application and how it can be applied today. There are my references for this paper. This concludes my presentation.